Welcome back to Outrage Science Bites. I'm David Beckmeyer, and this is day 18 of our 30-day challenge continuing our deep dive into bridging our divides. We've spent half a month on the problem, the incentives for outrage, the disinformation, the social media discord. Today, we want to talk about a potential fix, an idea our guests call the Great Reframing. It's easy to look across the political or cultural chasm and say, the problem is them. They're the ones with the wrong facts, the bad intentions, or the extremist views. But the Great Reframing suggests that the main problems are not caused by the other side, but by the way we interact with, dispute with, and frame issues with them, often adopting that simple us versus them mindset. The solution, then, is to realize that change starts with us. We have control over our own perspective and our own actions, and changing ourselves is a necessary prerequisite to changing the overall dynamic. To discuss how we begin this mental and behavioral shift, we'll hear from Guy and Heidi Burgess of Beyond Intractability. Here are Guy and Heidi.
So I'm interested in looking at the question of how we get out of this fix. Lots of people have been asking that same question lately. And obviously, it's a very complex problem, and any solution is going to be very complex. And we make a quip that all one variable theories are wrong, which of course is a one variable theory. But anyway, we do have a rather simple but hard to do idea that we think is key to getting out of this fix, and that's what we call the Great Reframing. And the basic idea is that everyone needs to realize that all of the problems that we're concerned about are not actually caused by the other guy, which we tend to think, but they're caused by the way we interact with and dispute with and resolve problems with the other guy or people. Or groups, or organizations, or nations. So, yes, there are a few bad faith actors who really do need to be dealt with, but in general, we tend to take these very complex situations and frame them as something very simple. It's us versus them, good guys versus bad guys. And elections come around and everybody's cheering that they either won or they're bemoaning that they're lost. And they're still framing things in terms of us versus them. And our problems, at least here in the United States, and it's being echoed in other places around the world, is that our problems are not primarily us versus them. Our problems are the way we deal with them, the way we treat them, the way we look at them. And that's what we need to look at, and we need to change. We need to understand how what we do is driving what they do, and vice versa. And if we would listen to them a bit, look at them differently, consider them as legitimate human beings, organizations, systems, we're going to be a lot better off, and we'll begin to build that off-ramp, as you called it, to get out of this fix. And then there's lots of other things that need to be done too. But until we do that reframing, until we move ourselves out of the us versus them approach, I don't think we're going to go anywhere. And the corollary to that is when we have an us versus them mindset, we think that the solution is for them to change. By changing the mindset to our great reframing, it's first on us to change. And we have control over us. We can change us. We can't nearly as easily change them, and we certainly aren't going to change them until we change us. So the ball's in our court, and we have the power to make the first move. And that is how I see us starting to get out of this fix.
Well, and you know, it's funny that you're sort of using the us and them language to even talk about that a little bit. And I think another piece of this nuance is that there really isn't a them, because it's just a bunch of individuals. that we collectively throw in a box. And yeah, they may share some traits, but it's really not that. Like, it's much more complex than that.
It is much more complex, although we do tend to coalesce. So it's easy to understand how we see each other as us versus them. But yeah, I mean, there's defectors who are moving out of their groups and people who aren't homogeneous with what we expect them to be. So that's another key corollary is everything's more complex than we assume it is.
Yeah, there are dynamics that force us into us versus them. That's what polarization is. That if you're in a fight with somebody else, you need allies. So you start building coalitions. And the other side says, well, I need allies too. And they build coalitions. And pretty soon you have these monstrous coalitions. And the conflict escalates, and the intensity of your fights and the tactics that you're willing to use intensifies. And so all of a sudden you have these giant coalitions fighting one another, and you can't end it because there's so many issues involved. You reach a compromise on issue one, but that doesn't settle it because you have all of these obligations to your coalition members to keep continuing their fight. And so it never ends. And we're stuck in a very bad place.
So what sort of practical step for somebody, that says, okay, I don't get it. Like, what does this reframing mean? What's a good first practical step for someone to think about?
I think a first step is to think about how they view people who have different attitudes from them. And if most of us do that honestly, we realize that we think they're stupid. We think they're evil. We think they're misinformed. We have negative views of them. And step back and ask yourself, what if that isn't true? What if they maybe have a legitimate reason for thinking the way they think? Maybe I should try to find out why that person who thinks differently than me thinks that way. So if you have a cousin or some other relative who votes oppositely from you, instead of just not talking to them, not inviting them to Thanksgiving, assuming that they're evil or stupid, consider approaching them and say, I'm really curious as to why you voted for so-and-so or why you like so-and-so. And not use it as a gotcha question. Use it as an opening, a real inquiry as to why they're thinking what they're thinking. Find out what their background is that maybe you don't know that led them to come to the conclusions that they did. Most often, you'll find out that actually they're much more sensible human beings than you had them figured for. Sometimes you'll find out they aren't. Sometimes you'll find out they're even worse than you thought. But most of the time, folks aren't. Most of the time, folks are reasonable, and they're coming to reasonable conclusions based on the information that they have, based on the situations that they're in. But we don't know those reasons behind their conclusions. So a first step is being curious. Instead of writing them off, ask questions.
Another key is to reframe our information feeds. That right now, most news outlets and cater to folks who believe that we're in this giant us versus them fight. And that's where the market is. And the analogy I make is that if you want to cultivate a garden, you don't read a manual about how to build a table. The information feed that we get that tells us how to fight the us versus them fight and why the other side is so evil and they just have to be defeated. is a very different information feed than one that focuses on how we really can live together and find ways of compromising on some issues and learning to live with differences on others and engaging in constructive debate over the really tough moral questions. But it's a different feed. And that information is out there, but it's a lot harder to find. But if you start systematically looking for that information, it's there. And if you start turning away from the us versus them algorithms, you can look at something different, and it's a whole different world. You're looking at at the same world from a different perspective, and you're focusing on different things. In a sense, this is the mass media analog of what Heidi was recommending, in addition to how you talk with your friends and neighbors. I mean, the real information, most of the information we get about these conflicts comes through the mass media. And so it's analogous. Instead of just turning off the media source that tells you some of these disagreeable things, engage with them, try to understand it. And you'll find that your worldview is different and all sorts of opportunities open up that you didn't think existed.
That's all for today's episode of Outrage Science Bites. Stay curious, and until next time, I'm David Beckmeyer. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy these Science Bites episodes, you may enjoy the long-form Outrage Overload podcast at outrageoverload.net.